Today's experience was sent to us by a brother. He died and was sent to hell. He met one of the world-renowned terrorists, and they gave him a shocking message to the living, especially the Muslim. Kindly stay to the end. My name is Abel Yukon. Every time I tried to share this experience with others, they either laughed or called me insane. They would ask me questions, mocking me. How could you die and see a Muslim in hell? How can you go there and not find your ancestors or relatives? Instead, you see famous figures from history like Osama bin Laden? Their skepticism turned me inward, and I questioned myself. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. And when I watched a testimony on this very channel, everything I had buried came flooding back to me in a vivid dream. It was as though God Himself was pushing me to tell my story, no matter what others thought. So here I am, sharing it, because someone out there needs to hear it. My journey to the other side began on a work trip. My firm sent me on a week-long assignment, from February 6th to February 11th, to finalize a business deal. They booked me into a luxurious hotel, a place that had everything: elegant rooms, world-class amenities, and a beautiful swimming pool where I spent most of my time unwinding. On the final more of my stay, the deal had been closed early, and I had 2 extra days to enjoy the hotel. I decided to take one last swim before heading home, something I did often to clear my mind. That morning, however, something felt different. As I slid into the water and found swimming my usual laps, an eerie sensation crept over me. My heart raced and my breathing became rapid. No matter how hard I tried to stay afloat, the water seemed to be pulling me down, and I couldn't swim to the edge. The struggle to stay above the surface was overwhelming, and in my frantic attempts to breathe, I swallowed water. The world around me blurred as my limbs grew heavier, and I slipped beneath the surface. My vision faded to black. I remember the moment I passed out. It was as if the world I knew vanished in an instant. There was no tunnel of light, no comforting vision of my body floating lifeless in the pool, as some near-death experiences describe. Instead, I found myself in a completely different place. When I opened my eyes, I was walking. I wasn't sure where I was, but it felt wrong, dark, cold, and distant. I found myself on a broad path, wide enough to accommodate the many souls walking alongside me. The path was eerie, but at first, there were no distinct details I could make out about the people around me. I couldn't even tell if I was clothed or naked. A deep sense of dread settled over me as I continued walking, my steps feeling as though they weren't entirely my own. There was no freedom to turn back, and a strange force seemed to propel me forward. The path ahead was unknown, but my soul knew that something was horribly wrong. The further I walked, the more intense the discomfort became. At first, the pain within me was slow, almost like a dull ache. But soon, I began to notice the others around me. Their agony was much worse. The farther we went, the more unbearable their suffering became. Their cries filled the air, desperate and horrific wails that pierced through the thick atmosphere. The path grew darker, and the reality of where I was began to sink in. I was in hell. The weight of this realization was overwhelming. I had always believed that as a Christian, living a righteous life and following God's will would spare me from such a fate. But now here I was, in the very place I had been taught to fear my entire life. My mind struggled to grasp the enormity of it. How could I, someone who had dedicated their life to serving God, end up here? As we moved forward, the pain inside me suddenly stopped growing, but for those around me it worsened. Their screams and the terror in their faces became more intense with each step. We were moving at a pace that defied logic, faster than any human could run, yet without the exhaustion one would expect. It felt as though an unseen force was pushing us toward an inevitable, horrific destination. Ahead, the path widened into a pit, a gaping hole that stretched into the depths of torment. I stood at the edge, watching as souls were thrust into the pit, their wails of agony intensifying as they fell into its fiery depths. The sight before me was beyond comprehension. The pit wasn't just hot, it was filled with a boiling, molten liquid that resembled magma. The souls trapped within writhed in pain, their bodies mangled and deformed from the searing heat. But it wasn't just the fire that caused their suffering. Horrific, monstrous creatures roamed the pit, inflicting brutal punishment on the souls trapped within. These creatures were terrifying, beasts of nightmare, whose sole purpose seemed to be to amplify the agony of the damned. But there was something even more horrifying. Small, insect-like creatures, possibly maggots or something worse, swarmed around and inside the bodies of the suffering souls. Their movement caused unimaginable pain as they burrowed in and out of the flesh of those in torment. I stood there, paralyzed by the sheer horror of it all, my heart breaking at the sight of such suffering. The cries of these tormented souls echoed in my ears, filling me with sorrow and dread. Yet I couldn't tear my eyes away. The scene before me was unbearable, a nightmare so vivid that it felt as though I was trapped in it forever. And as I gazed deeper into the pit, I realized that there was no end to the torment. It was endless, an eternal punishment with no escape. Then, something drew my attention, a particular area of the pit where the suffering seemed even more intense. The creatures were more active there, and the pain of the souls trapped within was far worse. Slowly, I was pulled toward that area as if by an invisible force. It was then that I saw Osama bin Laden. As I was drawn closer to that part of the pit, I saw him, Osama bin Laden, the man whose name had struck fear into the hearts of millions. He was hardly recognizable at first, but I knew deep inside that it was him. His body was burnt and scarred beyond recognition, as though he had been subjected to endless cycles of unimaginable pain. He was engulfed in flames that never ceased to burn. Unlike the others in the pit, his torment seemed different, more personal, as if his suffering was tailored to the magnitude of the evil he had caused. His was burn away and regenerate, only for the process to begin again. Surrounding him were creatures, demons, perhaps, who seemed to take pleasure in torturing him relentlessly. They clawed at his charred flesh, tearing at his wounds, inflicting indescribable agony, yet he could never die, never find relief. He writhed in agony, his voice hoarse from endless screaming. His cries were distinct, louder and more piercing than those of the other souls around him. The fire consumed him, but it never allowed him the mercy of disintegration. As I stood there, horrified by the sight, something unexpected happened. He looked at me. His burnt, hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I felt an immense, overwhelming sense of despair wash over me. There was no anger in his expression, no pride, just a broken, shattered soul. And then, to my shock, he began to speak. His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but I could hear him clearly amidst the wails of the damned. I was deceived, he said, his words trembling with regret. Everything I did, all of it. I was deceived. He paused, choking on his own agony, his body convulsing with pain. I thought I was doing God's will, but it was a lie. A terrible lie. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. This man, who had caused so much suffering, who had orchestrated some of the most horrific acts in history, was now admitting that he had been misled, that his entire purpose had been based on a falsehood. His words were drenched in regret, as though he had only realized the truth too late, and now, there was no way out of his torment. Tears streamed down his burnt, scarred face as he began to plead, his voice desperate and broken. "Please forgive me," he cried. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I thought I knew the truth, but now I see everything." His voice grew more frantic, filled with an almost childlike desperation, as though he believed that by asking for forgiveness, he could somehow escape the eternal torment he was trapped in. "Tell them," he begged, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Tell them I was wrong. I don't want anyone else to suffer like this. Please tell them." His hands reached out toward me, as if he believed I could somehow save him, pull him out of the flames that consumed him. "I would do anything to take it back, anything, but it's too late for me. Please tell the world. Don't let them be deceived like I was, please." His pleas echoed in my mind, resonating with a sorrow so deep that it felt like it would break me. But I knew in that moment that there was no forgiveness for him, no escape from the fate he had chosen. As I ventured deeper into the abyss, another figure came into view. It was Saddam Hussein. His body was bound in chains, each link glowing red-hot, branding his flesh as he writhed in agony. He screamed, his voice guttural and broken, no longer the voice of a powerful dictator, but that of a tormented soul, forever lost in the fires of hell. Demons circled around him, lashing his body with whips of fire, their laughter echoing through the air like the ringing of a cruel bell. His skin bubbled and cracked, and each new wound seemed more excruciating than the last. But unlike the others in that infernal place, his torment didn't just come from the physical suffering. I could sense it, there was a deeper agony within him, an endless regret gnawing at his soul. His face, though scorched and distorted, still bore the traces of the man he had once been, prideful, ruthless, yet now utterly broken. Through the veil of pain, he looked at me, as though he recognized that I had come to witness his suffering. His body trembled as he spoke. "I was deceived," he muttered, much like Laden had. "Everything I believed in, everything I followed, it was all a deception. I thought I was serving the truth, I thought I was defending Islam, but it was all a lie." His words, filled with bitterness, carried the sorrow of someone who had wasted their entire life on a falsehood. They told me I was doing God's work, that my rule, my cruelty, was justified by divine command. But it was not God's will. It was my own pride. My own hunger for power. His voice cracked as he uttered these words, the weight of his confession too much for him to bear. His head slumped forward, his charred hands clenched into fists, as if trying to grasp something, anything, that could absolve him of his sins. "I used the name of God to justify my crimes," he continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "I oppressed my people. I murdered thousands, all for the sake of holding on to power. And now I see. I was nothing but a pawn. I was lied to. Deceived by my own arrogance and the false promises of those who claimed to speak for God." His broken gaze turned towards me again, his voice rising with a desperate urgency. "Tell them," he pleaded, echoing Laden's final words. "Tell those who still live, those who follow the same lies I did. Tell them the truth before it's too late. Tell them that what they are following is not the path to salvation, but the road to destruction." In an instant, everything changed. The weight of darkness, the heat of the flames, the screams of the damned, they all vanished. It was as if I had been pulled from the depths of hell and thrust back into the world of the living. My eyes flew open, and I found myself lying on a hospital bed. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, every breath feeling like a lifeline that anchored me back to reality. For a moment, I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Had it all been real? The agony, the torment, the voices of the souls I had encountered, it all felt so vivid, more real than anything I had ever experienced. My body trembled as I processed the shock of returning from a place so far removed from life, a place where hope was lost and suffering reigned eternally. I had seen what lay beyond death, and it was not a peaceful rest. It was a place where the souls of the proud, the violent, and the deceived were punished without mercy. And yet, even in their torment, they cried out for those still living, warning them not to make the same mistakes, not to fall for the same lies. To my fellow Christians, I must speak plainly and urgently, hell is not a place reserved solely for those outside the faith. There is a dangerous misconception that only non-believers or those who reject Christ outright will end up in hell, while believers are automatically spared. This is not true. In my experience, I witnessed the torment of souls from all walks of life, from various beliefs and backgrounds, including those who once called themselves Christians. I saw firsthand that hell does not discriminate based on religion alone. What matters is the state of your soul and the choices you make with the truth you've been given. This is not meant to instill fear, but to wake us up to the reality that we are accountable for how we live our lives, no matter what we call ourselves. The time is now for us to realize the gravity of living a life that aligns with God's holiness. It's not enough to believe or to attend church. We are called to live in righteousness, to walk in the Spirit, and to strive for a life that reflects the purity and holiness of Christ. The souls I encountered in hell often spoke of their regret. Many of them had known about holiness but had lived with compromise, thinking they could mix the ways of the world with their faith. This is my experience, sir. Thank you for staying to the end of this experience. Save a soul by sharing this video with your friends and families, so that they will be saved from the path of hell. Subscribe to our channel if you have not, to remain updated whenever we share another experience that is being sent to us. Thank you.